education in Trinidad and Tobago, removing the masks.
Good afternoon to all our viewers on our YouTube channel ParlView and also on our Parliament Channel 11 and Parliament Radio 105.5 FM. We welcome all to this briefing, which is being hosted at the J. Hamilton Maurice Room at the Office of the Parliament. It's being held to update all our viewers and stakeholders on the outcomes of the Regional Parliamentarian Retreat on Building Caribbean Resilience. It was held at the Hyatt Regency Hotel yesterday and today, and was concluded a short while ago. My name is Atiba Wilshire, and I'll be the moderator for this afternoon's proceedings. I would like to introduce our panel to all viewers. The leader of our panel today is the Honorable Bridget Anisette George. She's the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago. To the Speaker's left is Mr. Richard Blewett. He's the UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative of Trinidad and Tobago. To our speaker's right is the Honorable Melvin Turnbull. He's a Member of Parliament from the British Virgin Islands. And to Mr. Turnbull's right is Dr. Lystra Fletcher-Paul. She's the Sub-Regional Coordinator of the Food and Agricultural Organization. We'll begin with a brief overview on the purpose of the retreat.
Good afternoon, Tiba, and good afternoon to Trinidad and Tobago. I think the retreat was really grounded against the backdrop of the recent weather events in the Caribbean. Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, we all know, had devastated consequences on many of our Caribbean nations. And generally, even though Trinidad and Tobago was not specifically affected, we knew it was a heightened hurricane season. We recently had our own experiences with flooding from, rain that wasn't really unprecedented rain. So I think the timing was appropriate for us to engage parliamentarians, and we tried to reach out to the entire Caribbean for us to sit intimately, share our experiences, and focus on resilience. How do we prepare ourselves better for events which experts tell us will become the new norm? And how do we, therefore, recover from such nature occurrences?
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Could you give us an idea of what were some of the main points that were raised, some of the main concerns and some of the main outcomes that came out of the retreat?
Okay, the retreat really focused on 3 areas: food, security and nutrition, health security, and on resilience budgeting. So that all of the discussions were really centered on those themes and not really just looking at climate change in the wider context. I think for all of us who participated, we got an appreciation of the existence of so many agencies and structures within the UN system that exists, with just not only resources, meaning physical resources, whether it's financial, whether it's in terms of stock and material, but in terms of expertise and advice. And one recognize that these agencies know the Caribbean, they operate in the Caribbean, they have coordinating capabilities and expertise. And it is really for us to understand that, get to know that, and avail ourselves of those opportunities to see how we can better prepare our countries and our constituents. The unique thing about targeting members of Parliament is the wide span of reach that an MP has. An MP has a constituency, so therefore he's on the ground. He can influence his community. He knows his community, he knows the vulnerabilities of his community. An MP, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, also has an oversight function through the operations of our Joint Select Committees. So from the operation of our Joint Select Committees, our MPs get an opportunity to do oversight and to make recommendations to various agencies. And then, of course, our MPs operate in the plenary of the Parliament, where they advocate positions. So a retreat like this just helps, enables, educates our MP to help on all the various levels that they operate.
My next question is for Mr. Blewett. Mr. Blewett, could you give us an idea of the role that the UNDP would have played in the retreat?
Well, firstly, just to echo the sentiments of Madam Speaker, we were very pleased to partner the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago with this effort. Obviously, the devastation in the Caribbean tells us, unfortunately, a story that, is not going to go away. And so building resilience for small island developing states is a huge priority. And I think we heard that from the parliamentarians that came to the conference. They decided to spend time coming to Trinidad and Tobago and raise their awareness of different dimensions of resilience. Member states around the world in 2015 agreed a thing called the Sendai Framework in Japan, which essentially is a 15-year framework for building resilience and reducing risk. It's got targets, and part of the retreat was to expose parliamentarians to the Sendai Framework, insofar as it relates to their national and local realities and priorities. UNDP was very happy to help organize the event with FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, with Parliament. And, the topics, we worked together, making sure the topics were really grounded in the reality of the region and relevant. So looking at health as a key issue, making sure that you have safe hospitals, making sure that, the primary healthcare systems are working in normal times so that when a crisis comes, they work when the crisis is upon you. Discussing gender and difficult topics like migrants and human rights to make sure that when you respond in a crisis that you have a normative framework addressing particularly vulnerable populations, disabled persons, older persons, and that you're organized before the crisis and that you handle the crisis well. Listra will talk a bit about the food security and the food systems dimension. And then I think one of the key topics UNDP has worked on is financing. It's a big challenge. If you're a small island developing state, you lack, if your whole island is nearly devastated and the tourism won't come back for some time, how are you going to keep running the government and getting, without the revenue? And obviously people in the private sector who work in tourism need jobs and income. So how do you help people recover? And I think there was very, very interesting discussions from a range of people from the Caribbean Development Bank, Professor Compton-Bourne, who's a homegrown specialist economist, who has looked at how do you measure development in the Caribbean beyond GDP, gross domestic product, that you look at also vulnerability. of small island developing states, and you change the criteria so that small island states can access financing, appropriate financing, to build back better. You don't want to build the islands back in the same way that they were devastated. And I think there were very sad stories told by some of the parliamentarians of the challenges that people had. You know, in Dominica, some people had already built back from 2 years ago from the last hurricane in the same place where they had built, and then they had their house broken again. And obviously, if you're not a wealthy person, and you're not insured, that's a huge problem. So we're very happy to have supported parliamentarians to take further ownership and understanding of the resilience agenda, and then they'll take it home to their countries and embed it.
In terms of boosting regional resilience to natural disasters, were there any problems or issues that are specific to the Caribbean?
Well, I think the issue that came out most markedly is the question about resilience budgeting. Because I think what we were exposed to showed us, well, look, and it made sense that if you understand the threats and you understand that your vulnerabilities, therefore, one of the things would be to budget for it. Budget almost as a sort of insurance, so that upfront you put aside for certain vulnerabilities. I think we had a representative from Cuba who had said and shown how well Cuba does this. The problem is, again, whether you have that latitude in your budgets to put something aside. You must do it, yes, but you have competing demands. And then again, also for the Caribbean, was in terms of the wider context of climate change, where you have to, meet certain targets and build in certain other sort of infrastructural requirements, and the costs and the expense, which we could hardly likely afford. So I think a lot of the challenges for the Caribbean, as discussed in the retreat, really were looked at in terms of finance.
And what about food security, Dr. Fletcher-Paul?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having us here. Food security has a number of different dimensions. There's the dimension of availability. There's one of access to food. There's also utilization of food, which speaks to the quality of the food you eat, the nutrition and the safety. And then there's the stability, which deals with having food at all times, even in times of hurricanes, droughts, floods. So in terms of the post-disaster food security, there was the aspect of, one, getting food immediately to the people who have been impacted by the event, but then getting the food system up and operating so that you do not have to depend on food that is brought in as food aid, but you put your agricultural system back in place. And by agriculture, we're talking about not only crops, we're talking livestock, we're talking fisheries. So at the meeting, there were two aspects. There was the World Food Program who came in and spoke about the food aid to get the people back to have something to eat immediately, the humanitarian aspects of it. And then FAO came in with respect to getting the agricultural system back in place, the recovery process. One of the things I wanted to point out as, in addition to the whole issue of finance, just in response to the question that was raised to Madam Speaker, was the whole issue of implementation. One of the criticisms that came out, or the recommendations, was that we need to focus a lot on implementation. We have a lot of these meetings, we talk a lot, but when we go back, we do not implement. So implementation is important. But an important point that came through too was that implementation was not only a function of government. The community has a responsibility. People have a responsibility to do things themselves. And so with respect to the food production, for example, communities have a responsibility to get their food production systems back in place. even your fisheries, your cooperatives, for example, fisheries. One of the areas of food security or agriculture that you don't have to wait for a long gestation period for the crops to grow or the livestock to grow is fisheries. You can go and fish immediately once your boats are in good condition. But, so you need to get going and not rely so much on government, but also recognize that the communities have the power and the ability to help themselves and feed themselves. And with respect to the whole issue of resilience, we spoke about the food system, because the food system is, the end product starts with what you put in the ground. In other words, we call it from farm to fork. It is the whole system that is involved, the inputs that you need, the people who are involved, the laws and regulations, the food safety issues, the food storage and processing, everything that takes it from the farm to the fork. So the system and building in the resilience all along that system is an important part of getting that sustainability and building back better. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Shane Superville from the Newsday newspaper here. Just to keep on topic with food security, as you've rightfully said, in the past, implementation has been one of the key challenges as far as, not only just cutting our food import bill in half, but building community level resilience and disaster response. But among that, what are some of the other key challenges that lie in place for food security as it is right now?
Food security is a function of, as I said, there are many pillars. So for availability of food, specifically, we talked about the whole issue of land tenure, the investment in food security. It means that farmers need to invest. If you do not have land tenure, if you do not have land that you can use as collateral, then you would be less likely to invest. Even at the governmental level, there's the need for investment in research. Because there's need for use of technologies, climate-smart technologies, which can improve the productivity. In other words, increasing the amount of yield you get per unit acre of land. And this is a problem. We're dealing with small island developing states. We have populations which are growing, and so the demand for land is increasing. So that in terms of our agricultural production, we have to increase the productivity. The use of technology is important there. The other issue is that of access, and access has two aspects of it. There's income, there's financial access, that means having the income to purchase the food, and also there's physical access, which deals with infrastructure, the roads to get to the farms and the markets. And what we have seen, for example, in Dominica is a number of those feeder roads were destroyed. You had landslides that cut off farming communities. So this whole issue of access to food and making sure that we have proper roads and markets for selling the food is important. Then the other aspect of food security, as I said, was utilization, which deals with nutrition and also food safety. For example, after a hurricane, you have no electricity, you have no refrigeration. A lot of the food is spoiled. And so even making sure that you have food that is, even canned foods, you have to look at the expiry dates. All of these are important aspects of the food system that we need to look at in the Caribbean. Food safety is an important issue. We import, in some countries, as much as 80% of the food we consume is imported. And so the quality of the food that we import is an important part of it because it is linked to the incidence of your chronic non-communicable diseases. So, and also the quality in terms of how safe is it. We had the problem here in Trinidad and Tobago of food fraud. And so the importance of legislation to deal with that. And then finally, the whole issue of disaster risk management, putting in place systems which would allow you to have food even in the event of a hurricane. And we're talking about things like food storage, agro-processing, storage of seeds, having seeds and fertilizers and inputs that are readily available, that even in the event of a storm, you can easily get it back to the community. And that may mean, in a regional context, not only having the food, the inputs available in the country itself, But maybe having the seeds and the fertilizers in a storage facility in another Caribbean country, which is not necessarily in the hurricane belt, for example, Guyana or Trinidad. And so they can provide the seeds and the inputs when it's available. And it brings to mind the whole issue of transportation as well. But you know, there's so many aspects of the food system that we need to talk about when you're talking about food safety and nutrition as well. Okay.
We now turn to Mr. Turnbull, who's from the British Virgin Islands. Could you tell us a little bit about what would be intended to put in place, or what has already been put in place, given the fact that the BVI was so heavily affected by the passage of Hurricane Maria?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the people of Trinidad and Tobago for allowing me to come into your territory, and to everyone on the panel. Hurricane Maria was predicated by Hurricane Irma. And Hurricane Irma in the BVI was also predicated by the August flood. So the BVI suffered 3 different natural disasters. Irma, which took the territory and basically neutralized it, destroyed millions and millions of dollars worth of property and development and infrastructural development. From a standpoint of being a member of parliament and having a constituency, I represent in the BVI the tourist areas of the BVI, where the beaches are, where 90% of the tourists come to. But looking even more in depth in that is that dealing with individuals and hearing the stories. And I said earlier during the conference that for the first time since Irma, I shared what my personal experiences were, because I just kept going. But one of the things that this conference has done for me, and that I plan to take back to the BVI and under the leadership of our premier and the government there, is understanding that is a theme that I've been carrying since August. Understanding that we are stronger together, and not just as a Caribbean nation, but as a people in totality, that we are stronger together. So one of the things that we have seen and experienced is that the BVI that I heard about growing up with my parents and grandparents and foreparents talking about, where they would look out for each other, they would care about each other, they would take care of each other. That's what I saw. And that's what I believe is the fabric of not just the BVI community, but the entire Caribbean community as a diaspora of people, that we have the ability to stand strong together. So from the conference, from the food aspect, from the health aspect, from the financial aspect of it, I think one of the things that we haven't done well is, even though Trinidad is here and Guyana is here and St. Kitts is here and Dominica is here and the BVI is there, one of the things that we haven't done there well, while still maintaining our individual personalities as countries, is if we band our ideas and our thoughts together and our resources together, and we go and present to the powers that be, so to speak, that the things that affect global warming and all the other facets of the world, we say we're standing here together as a Caribbean community, and these are the things that we require for small island territories, for islands affected by the hurricane, for islands affected by earthquakes. If we stand together as a united front, it is much easier for us to now receive the aid that we need and put into place the systems that have been talked about throughout this entire conference, for which I personally took liking to the food security as well as the financial budgeting aspect of it, because there is nothing that we could have done. Just being as frank and honest as I could. As much as you could have prepared, there's nothing that you could have fully prepared for what took place with Irma and Maria. But what you could do and what we can do is build on the experiences that existed and just work together and say, these are the things that Trinidad has in place, that Guyana has in place, and where BVI might be falling short, I would build on the strengths from those territories and see what I could do to develop and share. And the food sharing instance from Dr. Paul, it's amazing because right now, there are, just for example, there are no coconut or palm trees in the BVI, none. So just from aesthetics standpoint, we know within Trinidad and Guyana and different areas that haven't been affected, we will need to pull on those resources. So as it relates to BVI, we are standing together. We are stronger when we build together. And that's one of the things with all the partners that have helped us, the UN, the UK military, PAHO, and all the other agencies. We are grateful, we are eternally grateful, but now we're looking to now move to the next step to see how we can rebuild as well as strengthen with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean territories to get back.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. In terms of commitments, were any commitments given during the 2-day period?
Well, Atiba, I think for Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, the group would really be legislators. And I think the overall commitment we gave as a group was to really use our processes in Parliament to, one, bring greater awareness with respect to the threats we suffer, the fact that we need to focus on resilience, also in terms of how do we get built into some of our programs and policies the inputs of disaster risk reduction, the disaster risk management, so that from our end as legislators, we gave the commitments that we could deliver on. And therefore, in terms of how our Joint Select Committees function, how do members utilize the other procedures of Parliament, we intend to carry forward the theme of disaster preparedness, disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, to prepare our country for what is the new norm.
Thank you. We are just about to wrap up, if there's no more questions from the media. One more? Okay.
Hi, good day, Mr. Turnbull. In keeping with what you were saying earlier about, really standing together and coming together not only as a nation within the BVI, but within the region as well, were one of the items discussed throughout the retreat was that the cooperation between public and private sector in times of disaster management? Because I know that in the past this is something has been often discussed but never really implemented, so to speak.
Yes, it was, and if you would allow me to just back up for a second, I think in any country, we tend to look at what's the most recent thing that occurred, with the most devastation disaster that occurred. For us in the BVI, together with some of the other Caribbean countries, there have been problems that existed long before these occurrences. So I think the things that we have been talking about and have talked about so well over the years, I believe in terms of commitment from this conference, the legislatures that attended this conference, from the public as well as the private and some of the agencies that have already decided to join forces with us, is now how do we continue to go forward, strengthening those relationships to rebuild our economies, to rebuild our territories for the benefit of those of us who are presently here and for generations yet to come. So I believe right now the implementation and the laws that we have on the books, the enforcement of those laws, together with the public, together with the private partners, because at the end of the day, none stands on its own. The public doesn't stand by itself, nor does the private sector stand by itself. So I think, again, going back to my theme, if whatever we do now going forward, we'll do it together because we are stronger. So coming out of this conference, there's no doubt in my mind from the leaders that all sat in the room over the day and a half, 2-day conference, that we have all decided that we will continue to build on those things that we have said over the years.
Hi, good day. This last question is to the Honorable Anissa George. Well, from a local standpoint, through our local parliament, what can we expect to look forward to based on what you took away from this retreat?
Okay, so as I said before, the parliament itself, because we could only, as legislators, bind ourselves. So that, as you know, we have the joint select committees. What the joint select committees do is to hold the various departments of government to account. So that some of our focus, and I think if we are truthful, our focus has not been before really on disaster reduction, disaster management. So that in our approach to our joint select committees and the entities that we examine, you would see some of that coming out. And as you know, at the end of it, the Joint Select Committee prepares reports. And these reports contain recommendations, which go back to the various entities, and the entities are required to respond to the Parliament based on the recommendations, how they implement, and that's how we hope that we would start to engage our entities on the issue and see some, see some results. Further, I think, and this is not as yet firmed up, I think having regard to the fact that we got some of the Caribbean here, and you have to remember the Caribbean also includes the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, so we were able to get Cuba here. Our aims were much more lofty, but we must also remember that we pulled this off in under 3 weeks. We were able to get the BVI, we were able to get St. Kitts, we were able to get Dominica, Barbados. I think we got together about 16 countries. Our hope is to be able to engage the wider Caribbean together with the UN. And I hope I'm not embarrassing Richard here, but it's a hope. Sometime again next year, for us to meet again, to see how we build on what this retreat started, in terms of looking at the wider issue of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if you're not resilient, and if you don't prepare for natural disasters, there's no way you're going to attain any goal. So our hope is that sometime next year, and that's one of the big takeaways for us, is again, we can be able to organize a wider conference on the Sustainable Development Goals, building into it a bit of what we've touched, resilience, and resilience is the hope. It's okay to sit down and talk about all that has gone wrong and all who's suffered, and we're not downplaying that at all, because when we did health, part of it and the resilience is how do you prepare your people, not just in a financial way and in a material way, but psychologically. Okay? So that we hope that next year we can do the goals with resilience and the gender perspective, because any disaster impacts not just people, but the sexes, male and female, in different ways. And we've got to start looking at things in that way. So for us, hopefully, you will be able to say, you as an observer, that you've seen the Parliament taking a focus and trying to guide things, not just on the communal level, but on the policy level, on the delivery level of our various agencies and ministries. Because as Dr. Paul pointed out, one of the issues was implementation. And therefore, in guiding the agencies, the departments, the ministries to look at these things, hopefully that will impact implementation. And then, of course, the wider conference, which, again, helps us support each other as Caribbean nations.
We are just about ready to wrap up now, but I'd like to ask if there are any closing remarks before we sign off.
Okay, so I want to start off by saying that I want to thank the United Nations Resident Office, Mr. Blewett, as represented by Mr. Blewett and all his support staff. I want to thank the various agencies, Dr. Paul and the FAO. I want to thank, we had the World Food Program, we had the Caribbean Development Bank, we had various other agencies who'd come to share their experience and help us understand the issues. Very many issues were new to me, and I'm sure I'm not singular in that regard. I mean, just hearing about the Sendai framework, that was new to me. And I mean, that is something I think we have to look at as parliamentarians. So I really want to thank them for the great opportunity that they afforded us. As I said, it was a dash to get it done, but I think it showed the commitment of all the agencies to us as countries. I want to thank the various parliamentarians who came, because if I only just refer to Mr. Turnbull, getting out of the BVI is not the easiest of things. And with short notice, he was able to come to represent his country. We had the Speaker of Dominica also. We had a senator from Antigua, all countries stricken, and everybody's busy. Mr. Turnbull would tell you that his parliament sits on Monday, first sitting since the disaster, but he was able to come. And I therefore want to thank him in particular, but all the other parliamentarians who've left their busy schedules to come on short notice and participate. I also want to thank the staff, the clerks of the Parliament, the clerk of the House, the clerk of the Senate, and all the members of staff of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago who worked on this end of things to get this conference pulled off. I really hope that this is a start of not a conversation, but a movement, because I think movement has action in it. And I think this is a start of a conversation. Resilience, to me, represents hope. Hope in terms of us understanding that we are vulnerable. Hope in us understanding that each of us has a part, not just agencies and governments and international agencies, but as individuals. We have a responsibility. We have to recognize our actions have consequences. And therefore, we then now start to look at things a little differently, hold ourselves to a higher standard, understand that we are all participants in climate change, and it's real. It's not fake news, it's real. So that I really hope that this is the genesis of a movement, all with the objective of the sustainability of life in this beautiful Caribbean region.
Thank you. We have now come to the end of this briefing that we put on to update all on the findings, the outcomes of the Regional Parliamentarian Retreat on Building Caribbean Resilience. We'd like to thank the members of our panel who came out today to share with us. And we'd also like to thank the members of the media who came to spend time with us today. Also to all of our viewers on our Parliament Channel 11 and Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, and also through our YouTube channel, ParlView. My name is Atiba Wilshire, and we now return to our regular programming. Thank you.
Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago on Twitter. Our call sign is @TTParliament.